Brought to you by Penguin.
With Hope and Love. Written by Ellie Dean and read by Marlene Sidaway. Chapter 1. Burma, May 1945. The monsoon heat and humidity had risen swiftly during the day, the rain bucketing down through the jungle canopy in a ceaseless deluge which turned the soft earth into thick, cloying mud that ran in rivers right through the makeshift respite camp. The conditions made the exhausted soldiers' lives a misery, for clothes didn't dry, boots and feet rotted, and there were several instances of men having mould growing in the folds of their skin from being constantly damp. It was now late afternoon, and although there was a canvas of roof and thick matting spread over the floor of steel sheeting in the motor maintenance area, Second Lieutenant Jim Reilly was soaked to the skin with sweat and mud as he lay cursing beneath the 3-ton truck. He was struggling to remove its broken exhaust pipe before darkness fell, but the bloody thing seemed to be welded with rust to its moorings, and he couldn't shift it. The wrench slipped from his wet hand for the 3rd time, and, as he dodged to avoid it landing on his face, he cracked his head on the differential, an unforgiving great lump of metal beneath the truck. Spitting out a string of oaths, he impatiently yanked on the thick leather gloves he'd previously discarded because they made him even hotter, and taking a deep breath to keep his temper at bay, started work on the stubborn bolt again. His task would have been simple enough in ordinary circumstances, but he was in a hurry, and what with the rain and the draining heat, he was beginning to wish he hadn't taken over from the young sapper. However, he'd missed working on the tools, and after the past 4 months of almost constant fighting with the Japanese, he'd hoped the familiarity of the task would help him banish the memories of what he'd witnessed during the liberation of Rangoon. Jim blinked away the stinging sweat and brushed the muck off his face, which sifted down from the underside of the truck as he attacked the bolt with added vigour. But the images of what they'd encountered in Rangoon still haunted him. After the Battle of Pegu was won in March, Jim and his men had arrived in Rangoon to mop up any resistance, only to discover that the city had been abandoned by the Japanese, who'd fled by land and sea, resulting in 9 of their 11 convoy ships being sunk by the British destroyers anchored offshore. Before the Japanese had left the port, they'd looted and destroyed it, going as far as bombing the convent which had served them as a hospital, killing 400 of their own men, before locking the Burmese prisoners in their wooden huts and burning them to the ground. The 1,000 Allied POWs they'd found had escaped this terrible fate, for the Japanese had planned to take them with them as slaves, but soon realized that in their desperately weakened state they'd slow them down. As ammunition was in such short supply, they didn't want to waste bullets by shooting them, so they'd abandoned them to the lawlessness of the dacoits and a city which was already starving and rife with disease. The POWs had been held in the city jail for several months, and were so emaciated and weakened by starvation, slave labour and disease, they were barely living skeletons in their filthy rags. As they waited to be loaded onto a requisitioned sampan to be taken upriver to the safety of an Allied airlift to hospital, Jim had remembered how desperate young Sarah Fuller was for news of her father and fiancé, who'd been captured after the fall of Singapore. So he'd asked if any of them had come across a Jock Fuller or Philip Tarrant. None of them had, and Jim wasn't really surprised, for he knew there were thousands upon thousands of prisoners in numberless camps spread right across Burma, Malaya, and Thailand, to the islands in the East China Sea, and even on the Japanese mainland. God only knew what they were going through.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?